Hello, and welcome to All the Grief, a regular podcast for all those who have been touched by grief. We are your hosts. I am Rebecca Luttrell.
And I am Andrea Mathern. We are two friends, a therapist, and a social scientist, both highly sensitive fellow grievers, here to share our hearts as we talk about all the grief. Good morning, Rebecca.
Good morning, Andrea.
It's so good to see your face. How is your heart this morning?
Oh, my heart. I'm in a place where I feel so aware of the preciousness of the present moment and trying to stay in it. And my mom is visiting. We saw her maybe 3 years ago, but she hasn't been here in 5 years. And it's just hard to balance the things that I have to do in a day. And then the way that I just sort of know what's important is not all the to-dos in a day, but then my anxiety doesn't know that. And so it's like my heart's beating fast and I'm just like trying to hang out. I'm like, I have things to do. So it's just a lot of balancing that. But I always come home to this idea of this precious present moment will not happen again. So just stay here and don't go into like the future of to-dos, which is not my nature. So that's kind of where my heart is today. How about you, Andrea? How is your heart this morning?
Oh, my heart's a little all over the place. Man, it's just like, I just would like to not do October maybe ever again. Last year we shared on the podcast, right when we launched, I lost my cousin very suddenly, my grandmother 10 days later, my uncle within a week after her. And this year, a year to the day of losing my cousin Erica Hiron passed away at 48 from complications from breast cancer. And it just is like profound. It's like a season anyway. Like fall is such a season to reflect, and a season for me, in our culture and so many cultures, when sort of the veil is thin and you're thinking a lot about your ancestors and thinking about putting together our ofrenda and remembering last year I added 3 pictures and that I'll add another picture this year is just a little tender. So yeah, my heart is like, it's all over the place.
Yeah.
There's no word for my heart today. It's so.
Yeah.
Yeah. But as always, I'm glad to be here with you, in a space that can hold the complications of my heart. And what a beautiful synergy for the guest that we have today, both sort of being present in the moment, which is one of the lessons I learned from her book, and also just sequential losses, which I also related to in this book in a really devastating way. So this morning we have Jessica Fein, who is the author of Breathtaking, a memoir of family, dreams, and broken genes. She is also the host of I Don't Know How You Do It podcast, which features people whose lives seem unimaginable and who triumph over seemingly impossible challenges. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Newsweek, Psychology Today, the Boston Globe, HuffPost, Scary Mommy, and more. Jessica is a relentless warrior in the memory of her dynamic daughter, whom she lost to a rare disease in 2022. Her work encompasses hope, humor, grit, and grace, the tools that make up her personal survival kit. So we welcome to the show, Jessica.
I'm so glad to be here with both of you.
We're so delighted to have you. So Jessica, how is your heart this morning?
Well, I have to tell you, I was really struck by what each of you said. And so, Rebecca, it's interesting because you were talking about having all of the to-dos and that's where your kind of comfort is and trying to be in the present moment. And that's definitely where my comfort zone is too, is like getting it done, checking off the list. And I lived that way so intensely for so many years. And now that things have forcibly slowed down, it makes me very uncomfortable. I'm like, where's that to do? How could I have a whole weekend unfolding in front of me without 10,000 things I need to do? That actually makes me uncomfortable. So I'm trying to reconcile that and be like, it's okay to just let the weekend present itself. That is definitely different for me. And then thinking of October and what that brings up for us, last year was the first year that I put together, and please forgive my pronunciation, an ofrenda.
Beautiful. Oh.
And it was so meaningful. And my kids, who were born in Guatemala, loved it. And I loved it. And it was both totally heart-wrenching because it was a very full display. There's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I just felt surrounded. So I guess where my heart is feeling a little bit of what each of yours is feeling too.
That's so beautiful. I'm so glad you did it. I always do it with my boys, and it's always that combination of just this beautiful, which is the purpose of it, right? Is this beautiful memory keeping and keeping people alive. And I remember the very first year my boys were sort of like a little more understanding of the entirety of it. And I said, "What do you think, guys? Like, how are you feeling about this?" They had dropped another thing that you can do the night before. So on Halloween night or on November 1st, you can drop marigold flowers as a path to your ofrenda, and the dead can smell it. And they dropped them all over the house. They wanted their ancestors to walk to their rooms and visit their new puppy who, we always put our dogs on our ofrenda as well. And Gabriel looks at me and he's like, "Well, there's going to be a lot of people in this house."
Exactly. Out of the mouths of
Mhm.
babes.
Exactly. So, wow, Jessica, Rebecca and I were preparing for this interview yesterday, and usually we start with a sort of grief origin story. And we were reflecting, like, my goodness, there is so much in this beautiful book about all of the losses that you experienced in a very short time frame. But there was one, and the way you talked about it was sort of it changing the lens of the way you would see every loss that came after that. So we'd love for you just to kind of walk us through that first life-altering loss that you experienced that kicks off pretty early in your book.
Yes. And I felt it was really important to start my book with that loss, which is the loss of my sister Nomi, because as you point out, it was the one that changed me. And it actually, what I don't put in the book is that it came just 3 months after the death of my stepfather.
Mhm.
Oh,
My stepfather was, in the scheme of things, not old, but older and had a lengthy experience with cancer. And it was very much an expected death. So it was all of the things that we feel when we have a death that is very, very close to us, but it was not a shock.
Mhm.
When my sister died at age 30, it was a shock
Mm.
in every sense of the word. I mean, I had been on the phone with her that morning chit-chatting about just the mundane stuff that sisters who have the fortune to also be best friends
Mm.
chit-chat about. And so later that day, when she was playing with her 1-year-old baby, she died.
Mm.
She died suddenly. So the shock of that and the understanding of how everything can be altered in a split second
Yes.
mm,
just made me see things totally differently, as did learning to navigate the world without my sister. I had never spent a day of my life without her. She was 3 years older than me.
right.
Mhm.
And so everything kind of changed after that. And it really did lay the groundwork because there were so many losses that came afterwards. But I had already changed by the time all those other ones hit.
Mhm.
And that first loss was kind of integrated into every one that came after, for better and for worse. I mean, part of it is with every subsequent loss, for those of us who have had multiple, it brings up all the ones before because you're like, wait, I just want to hold my sister's hand now. Where is she? I just want to talk
Mhm.
to my
Mm,
sister about this. Or, whatever, the people who have gone before, you want to be like, can you believe this? And so no other loss is ever felt, experienced in isolation.
yeah.
At least that's my experience.
Yeah. That's such a beautiful reflection. I think so many of us can relate to that exactly. And also just the tenderness. We have interviewed another author who writes about sibling loss specifically, and what a unique loss that is that so often goes untalked about, unspoken about.
Siblings are absolutely the forgotten mourners. And the thing that is
Yeah.
unusual in my story is that not only have I lost my two sisters, but I am also the mother of two children who have lost their sister.
Yes.
So I
Yeah.
view their loss so differently, having been them.
Yes.
But I think you're probably talking about Annie Orenstein, who has a terrific book out. Yeah. And she and I spoke quite a bit about this as well, because there's so much focus on the parents
Mhm.
when a child
Right.
dies, and I will never forget the day my sister died. A friend of my mother's came to me and said, "You need to take care of your mother now.
Oh, yeah.
Losing a child is the worst thing that can ever happen to somebody."
Mm.
And I was like, "I need to take care of my mother. What are you talking about? Isn't my mother taking care of me?" Number one. Number two, I really take offense to the notion that losing a child is the worst thing that can happen
Mhm.
to anybody. And I say that having lost a child, so I feel that I can say it.
Yeah.
I don't think we need to decide what is the worst thing that can happen to somebody.
Mm.
Every loss has its own texture and its own personality, and I'll tell you, losing a sibling was right up
Mhm.
there,
Mm.
and I'm not saying one was worse than the other, but it rubs me the wrong way when society decides what's worst for
Mhm.
everybody.
Mm.
Yeah, you're speaking to sort of that idea of the hierarchy of grief, like, "This one's worse, this one's
Yes.
better, I don't deserve."
Yes, but I do need to say that while I am speaking to the hierarchy of grief, I have mixed feelings about the
Yeah,
hierarchy of
same
grief,
here.
because sometimes I feel like, okay, but let's just all understand that a grandparent is a different kind of
Yeah.
loss. You know what I mean? On the one hand, I'm like, don't tell me what's better and what's worse. And then I'm like, but also your grandfather was 98 and he lived a long and healthy life. You know what I mean? So sometimes I feel like I'm a total hypocrite, but at least I'm an honest hypocrite.
Yeah, it's reminds me of how Megan Devine describes, like, the out of order deaths.
Yeah.
There's a certain shock and trauma that is coupled with the grief in those out of order deaths.
That's right,
Yeah.
and I love everything that Megan Devine has to say and writes, and I think that's right. Young sibling loss is an out of order loss as well,
Yeah.
and so,
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely.
So, in this beginning period where your book starts out, so obviously there is yet another sort of trauma that happens, though different because it doesn't feel quite as out of order. You were seeing your stepfather's illness. You knew death was sort of on the horizon, but your sister was this out of order traumatic loss. And in this time capsule that I remember being like, what chapter am I on? Because it just seemed like the sky started to begin to crumble all at the same time. So tell us about that sort of time capsule at the beginning of the book.
Yes, so after those 2 back-to-back losses of my stepfather and my sister, which is really at the very beginning and almost like an intro to the book and not really the key story, the next loss chapters, no pun intended, that I went through was really around fertility
Right.
and this lengthy quest to become a mother, a journey that started in the kind of conventional and
Right.
fun way and went all the way through like every medical procedure one could imagine and was, monthly loss for years and also pregnancy loss and, every creative approach to becoming a parent that you have read about,
Yeah.
we tried. And then finally we were like, why are we doing this? We would much rather adopt. Like that's much more interesting. And our family clearly is meant to be built that way. So that was, a 5-year period of highs and lows. And anybody who's been through fertility treatments knows those highs and lows and the roller coaster and the raised hopes and the dashed dreams and all the stuff we deal with. But ultimately, our dream about how we were going to be a family changed and did end in a really beautiful way with the adoption of our 3 babies from Guatemala. And then we set out on
Right.
another journey of growth and happiness and beauty and loss and devastation all kind of mudged together.
Yeah. There was a very, for me, very relatable. I was able to conceive through IVF, but had a similar up to that point journey as you. And you talked about being pregnant on your honeymoon, right? Of like,
Yeah.
like we did it, here we are, and sort of caretaking what you believed you were growing your new baby. And it was so tender. So months before we were married, we decided to just start. We were older when we got married, so we were like, we're already on the losing end of this game.
Geriatric, right?
Yeah.
30 and geriatric.
Yeah. And so we had a couple of losses, but then we got pregnant and we went on our honeymoon and I had morning sickness. It was just terrible. Lost the baby when we got back, but it was such a tender, just like when you're filled with nothing but hope and you're so optimistic. It was just so beautiful and relatable, even though you know that that's not the ending for you. But it was just such a tender, optimistic story that you shared about your honeymoon.
Thank you. Thank you. And you're the first person really to bring up that particular bit. And I actually really liked it too, because I remember it so viscerally. It's the first time we've had unprotected sex. We've been so careful. We
Right.
dated for 10 years. We're so careful. We're so, and now we have unprotected sex. So of course I'm pregnant, right?
That's what we were told.
Right, exactly, exactly. There was so much energy all along for all these years about trying to make sure that.
You don't get pregnant.
Right. And so now it's like, okay, well, I must be pregnant. And it was just so funny in terms of thinking back to that time and how it really did dictate everything we did and everything I didn't do because of this hypothetical,
Right.
baby that I was carrying, which of course I wasn't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 No, I thought it was so tender because I feel like so many of us have had that moment as when you're wanting to become a parent. And so
Yes.
each cycle is that opportunity for that baby
Right.
to take
And it
hold.
becomes kind of addictive,
Yeah.
It's hard
Mhm.
to give up and change the dream because you feel like, well, this might be the month.
Right.
Yeah. And all the other subsequent things that you have to do are so, my goodness, talk about to-dos. I remember once just sitting in my chair crying, and I was like, this is never how I imagined getting pregnant, like
Right.
being by myself in a bathroom at work, giving myself shots.
Yes.
Ugh. So that is such a complex shift of, okay, now this is what we're going to do because I want to be a mom. And then you yet went to another shift, and we said it in your intro, but you bring in humor as well. And what a funny moment to have read about that dinner where you bring over the the surrogacy couple to dinner, and you're just kind of like, I loved how you wrote about your complex, like, how do I come to a decision about this? This feels like a little more connected than I was hoping. And your mother there during an election cycle, and it just made me giggle.
Thank you. That is, of all the scenes, the one that I'm like, if they ever were to make a movie of my book, that's the one I can imagine the most, because
Yes.
there was in my mind so much at stake when we had this person. I mean, it was the night before our embryo was going to be put in her body, as a gestational carrier. We were going to be connected in this beyond most human way. And yet we were total strangers, and I'm trying to impress her.
Right.
And I'm so worried that, my mother's going to like say something wrong, or my father's going to offend them, or who knows, because I need them to like me.
Right.
And it was just such a bizarre out of body experience. I remember it so well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was so amazing. I was glad that you shared it. It was humorous, and I think there was something so relatable. And there's that point that you just made, which I felt like was such a theme throughout the book. And I'd love to know sort of where you are on this now throughout the book. So you just said, I wanted her to like me, right? Like this was
Yes.
so important. And like this idea that if she liked you or if the doctors liked you,
Yeah.
that the care that you were given would be more specific, would be better. And so spending a lot of time to be like, I want them to know us and like us, which there's something so human in that. But I'm curious sort of what your learnings, because it was a theme throughout the book up until some of the last chapters.
Yeah, and I think that that is how we tend to feel with these people, where our lives feel like they are in somebody else's hands. And we're like, if I can get them to give an incremental
Mm.
extra amount of attention, I want that. Like, I don't want to be the one that's annoying them and they're going to like race out of the room. But I think we can also focus too much on that. But I remember very much, and I put this in the book, a conversation with my sister who is suffering from stage 4 lung cancer. She's having a horrible evening. And I'm telling her, you got to call the doctor. You got to call the doctor. And she's like, I don't want to bug the doctor.
Right.
We're worried that we're going to bug them, and then they're going to be like rolling their eyes to their partner or whatever. And we just, and I'm like, but this is their job. You've got to page the doctor. And I just do think that that is this natural thing we have of wanting to be the one that's going to encourage the extra, which is kind of bonkers and also so understandable. But I will say, when our lives for so many years became one where we had a whole cast of characters coming in and out of our house with doctors and nurses and personal care attendants and this and that and the other thing, that became really hard, because now we had people who were in our house all the time. And you're never so aware of what you do in the privacy of your own house until
Right.
it's no longer like there's no privacy. Because, look, we all like yell at our kids
Right.
sometimes or like leave the dishes in the sink for 3 days sometimes, or I mean, I don't know.
Mhm.
I do. Or
Relatable.
whatever the thing is. And now we have all these people who are helping to care for our daughter and we need them desperately. And we don't want them to be like, this house is crazy. I'm going to pick another job, but
Right.
you can't live like that all the time. And we never had a moment alone. I mean, we had people all the time because for 8 years, our daughter required 24/7 care.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I mean, sorry to say, I actually loved how quickly your husband fired people. I was like, and you were like, can we just give him a second chance? But
I know. I was like, we need them. Like, if they're not here, one of us is staying up all night. And he's like, yes. And I'm that person. Like, he had no problem with that. And he was absolutely right and better than I was at it. There's no question. And still, I was like, do you have to be so sanctimonious? Because I just want to give them another chance so we can sleep in the same bed, which
Right.
we were not accustomed to doing by that point.
Right.
But it was very funny, actually, my husband's role in the book, not necessarily in life, because the biggest piece of feedback I got from every editor or reader along the way as we were in the editorial process who didn't know us said, well, you've made your husband into a saint. Nobody's going to believe him. He's not a believable character. And I tell my friends, and they were like, well, they don't know Rob. And I was like, I know. And so then I told Rob, I was like, all right, we got to knock you down a couple levels. Like, we've got to make you into a cad. And he was like, he didn't
yeah,
care. He's like, do whatever you need to do. But, I had to add some scenes and they were true. I mean, that scene where we are fighting about whether or not to fire the nurse who's sleeping on the job, whose only job is to stay awake by our
yeah.
daughter's side during the night. Literally, that is her job. And so if she's sleeping and with headphones in, nonetheless, of course she should be fired and she's not doing anything. But I just felt like, but she's here. And then we're going to have to find another
Mhm.
nurse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, completely relatable. I'm going to kind of segue because I have this thought that we were talking about over dinner the other night with Andrea and her husband, and me and my boyfriend. And we were talking about men and women handling grief differently. And I guess we didn't hear a lot about, I mean, it was sort of like you guys would take turns of being the one who was the solid one while the other one could fall apart. But
Yeah.
yeah, what was your husband's grief like and how was that different? Or,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I will tell you that now our grief is very, very different. And
Mm.
what I mean by that is I find having these conversations, I find having written a book to be immensely, I don't know, helpful isn't the right word, but it means so much to me because what we are doing right now is we're sitting around talking about my
Mhm.
daughter,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And I love
Yeah.
that. In whatever way I have the opportunity to have conversations about her, that's a gift to me. He would loathe doing anything
Yeah.
like this. This is just, he's so internal. And I'm like, let's talk about her. Let's look at pictures. Do you want me to hold up a picture? You know what I mean?
Mhm.
He would like to go sit by her, in the cemetery and just be quiet and be in peace.
Mhm.
And that's gorgeous. I would like to have conversation, so it's just so
Yeah.
different. And I think that is just a teeny tiny little microcosm of how each of us deals with it in
Right.
such a different way. So yes, maybe it's a men
Right.
versus women thing. I don't know. But I also think one of the things that was surprising to me with that very first major surprise loss of my sister was realizing how each of us deals with the loss differently because the loss is unique
Yes.
to each of us, even if we've lost the same person who is related to us in the
Right.
same way. So, my first sister who died, Nomi, it struck me very quickly that what I was going through and what my other sister was going through was totally different. And that was strange because I was like, wait, we both lost our sister. We both lost Nomi, the same person. And yet I lost an older sister. Rachel lost a younger sister. I lost a sister who was my best friend. Rachel lost a sister where she felt like they still had stuff to resolve. I mean, whatever.
Mm.
It's just
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
who we were to that person and who they were to us is different. And therefore, the texture of the loss is different. And so I think it's just yet another way that grief can be so very isolating.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes. And I would add to that, sometimes I get sort of resistant to the idea of gender differences. I feel like, no, we all experience things differently. But then I realize, like Andrea and I even were saying, it's like so many more women have written books on grief than men. And I think there is
Mm.
something in that desire to connect through talking, and whether that's culturally.
That's a really interesting point. And yeah, I can think of a few men, but way more women. And when I think about my show where I talk to people, it's not only grief by any means. I talk to a lot of people who are parenting in complex situations or other things that cause people to say to them, I don't know how you do it. I would say I could count probably on one hand in 100 shows or so the number of men I've had. It's all
Yeah.
women.
Yeah.
So that is really interesting.
That is. That is. Well, let's back it up just a little bit and talk about how you did come into your family. So let's talk about your journey and how you got your family together and how not just Dahlia, but your two boys also came into your life.
Well, if we're going to talk about how I got my family together, let's start with my husband.
Yeah, why not?
One of the things that I love about adoption is that I feel like we choose our spouses, and I feel like our kids and us chose each other. Now, I know that sounds kind of
Mhm.
woo woo because it wasn't like we all got to know each other and then picked each other, but I feel like we were all meant to end up together. My husband says if we didn't end up with these specific three children, he believes at some point in his life he'd be somewhere on an airplane or in a mall and he'd see our kids with on some other family and be like, what's our kid doing with them? But I do love this idea of the five of us finding each other. And I do believe that that happened because I know that this is how it was meant to be, that I was meant to be the mother of these kids and that they were, that we were all meant to be together, that they were meant to be siblings. In any event, what ended up happening was we did choose, as I mentioned, to adopt. And once we made that decision, we both felt very strongly about international adoption. And one of the great things is when you and your partner agree on such a huge decision so viscerally, you don't really need to explore why.
Right. Because hadn't you prepared something to present to your husband? Was that this one?
Right.
And he
Well,
was like, I'm
and
with you. Yeah.
yeah,
You're like, but
exactly.
wait, I
Right.
have a
I've got this
folio
whole
here.
Yes. Well, it was very funny because my older sister adopted and we were going through it at the exact
Right.
same time and
Right.
she adopted domestically.
Yeah.
And it was such a different process, a different journey. Everything was different. And she and her husband just knew they wanted to adopt domestically. Now, for them, they wanted a brand new baby, a newborn.
Yeah.
And for us, that wasn't important at all. And for international adoption, then anyway, you weren't going to get a newborn and that's what they wanted. But once we made the decision, we were very open to any country. We had no relationship to Guatemala. We had never been there, but for a number of reasons, that's when I had my spreadsheet about okay, how long will it take? Where are the kids before you get them?
Right,
Foster care
right.
versus orphanage versus this and that. We ended up with Guatemala. And once we adopted our first from Guatemala, then we knew for 100% that we wanted our children to share
Mm.
their heritage. So we knew we'd adopt our whole family from Guatemala.
Yeah.
And I love there's a moment, I think it's with Jonah, your first child, that you say something, I've been waiting for you too, I think was something you were saying. But the feeling that you said something like 5 years before that he was finding you, but at this point he's not five. And I was like, God, I
Right.
just broke. I mean, I cried, but it was such a sweet awareness of that idea that you're talking about. We were supposed to be a family. These were our children.
Right.
And this was just the channel.
Yeah. Now, I do wish that knowing how it was going to end, we could have skipped the 5 years of, the fertility
Right,
treatments
right.
and just been like, go on vacation and have fun for those 5 years. It's all going to be fine. If only we knew what was going to be coming, what was meant to be.
Right,
Right.
right.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful way to have built your family, and listening to that first one was really tender, of meeting your son for the first time and rubbing his back, and that sort of just spiritual exchange that you two had. Like, I've been waiting for you. We're a family. And he was like, hi, mama. I've been waiting for you. I was like, okay, I'm in, Jess. Let's go. So your family, you've built your family. You have Jonah, you've met Dahlia, you have Theo. So you had this bubble, these early years where you had some questions about Dahlia's development, but you seemed in the book, another thing that we talk to women about, particularly we had a woman on who has a medically complex kiddo, about her own intuition versus what the medical
Mhm.
what the medical system was telling her. So tell us about like what you were seeing and how you were balancing like hope and optimism that they were right with also like, and I feel like I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. And I mean, I just really do think that as parents, we are with them all the time.
Mm,
We know. And I have so many people I know in the rare disease community in particular, but where it's the parents who just have to keep on pushing and pushing for doctors to say, yeah, you're right. Let's do some tests, because I'm sure doctors all day long get parents who are like, oh my God, la, la, la. And so it must be hard for them as professionals to parse where there really is something happening and where there isn't. But I would say to any parent who suspects something is off, do not give up your gut, because we do know best. And, for me, that was really hard because I kept thinking about the whole, mother's intuition. And if that is really a biological thing, which, some studies say that it is, can I have a mother's intuition this early on as an
mm,
adoptive mother? But Dahlia's development was different and off in that her speech was garbled and her gait was uneven, these kinds of things. But 3 times I had early intervention come to the house. And 3 times they said, she's on the lower end of average, but give her time. We don't know what her prenatal was like. We don't know what, her care was until you got there. Essentially, like, calm down.
Yeah.
yeah,
And so it did take years before I finally was able to get the first hint of what was happening. And that was because we did a hearing test.
right.
And that led to the ultimate diagnosis very quickly,
Yeah,
which was Murph syndrome, which is an ultra rare form of mitochondrial disease that stands for myoclonus epilepsy, ragged red fibers. And what's interesting about it is that the speed really was in part due to the fact that she was adopted. What I mean by that is that for mitochondrial disease, it's an average of 7 years to get a diagnosis.
mm,
Ours was so quick because once she had the hearing loss, there was a question, why hearing loss? And we were referred to genetic testing. Genetic testing is something that a lot of families, for sure then, much more so then, but even still, have to really fight for. And we got it right away because there was no way to know what was going on otherwise. And because Dahlia's disease was showing up in her blood, which also isn't always the case, that
mm,
blood test gave us the diagnosis. Now, that doesn't mean we understood anything. We didn't understand what the diagnosis meant. Literally, we didn't understand what it meant. Figuratively, it made no sense to us, but we had something we could Google.
right.
Now, the thing is, you assume if you get a diagnosis, you're going to get a cure. Like, we
Yeah.
just need the diagnosis so we can know what to do.
Totally.
What you don't expect is you're going to get a diagnosis that's going to sound like it's in a foreign language, where you're going to be told, like, a handful of people in the world have this thing, where you're going to be told there's no cure. And we don't know anything about it because it's so rare. And, there's not that much being done and, all of these things. And look, that was already more than a decade ago. Today, that diagnosis would mean something different.
Mm,
With any illness, it's timing,
yeah.
right? I mean, I look back even at what they discovered caused my sister's cardiac arrest all those years ago, and it would probably be different today. So it's a timing thing, and you want to be able to hold on and control so that you will have an opportunity to be the recipient of more studies and more research, et cetera. But that's just our fantasy of control, which none of us has.
And you speak to that, Andrea and you share the sort of back to back losses thing where it was sort of the first loss feeling like, and it was my dad, but it was out of order in that he was 53, and so it was been pretty cool life. I had complaints, but then it was just like back to back loss. And the idea you say, like, any notion of fairness or order is a fantasy. And it
Mm,
just like
Yes.
struck me. Yeah.
Yeah, and I thank you so much for using the word relatability, because one of the things that I think is so interesting about memoir in general is that when we talk about really specific, unique stories, that's when people can relate. I
yeah.
mean, people aren't relating to Murph syndrome. I would put all my money on the fact that nobody who's connected to Murph syndrome has even read this book. But that doesn't matter. It's not about the specific diagnosis. It's those details that when we're reading, we can find our own stories in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and speaking of the relatability, You were so generous in sort of your own reflections about your own strength and where you were sort of in the emotional process and the sort of like technical dealing of everything that made caring for your daughter complex. And there was this moment where you talk about the way that people viewed your family, right? Like, oh, this altruistic family who took on this high needs child, medically complex child. And it was just so honest where you were like, we didn't.
Yeah.
We didn't. And I don't know if I would have. And I'm so glad that I didn't know
Yeah.
because she is my daughter. It was so honest because I think sometimes we all find ourselves someplace we never expect it to be. And the interpretation of the outside world might be really generous.
Right. That's what I
Sometimes.
felt. I wanted to be like, no, I am not. That's not me. And there are people who raise their hand and sign up
There
for this.
are.
And they are heroes. I don't deserve to be put in that bucket. I didn't sign up for this. I would not have raised my hand for it and didn't. I mean, we had forms that said, would you take a child with this, that, and the other thing? And I was like, nope, nope, nope. I was like, why? I've waited all this time. I'm not going to volunteer for that. That wasn't what I
Yeah.
wanted. And thank God we didn't know so that my daughter could find me and I could find her because by the time she was diagnosed, there was no question that we belonged together.
Yeah. Yeah. I just thought that was so beautiful because I know, like I said, we've interviewed another mom of a medically complex kiddo, and I think the world views her that way too. And
Yeah.
she's like, no, I
Yeah.
had my baby and this is what happens. And I'm his
Right.
mom.
Right. And it is interesting too, because as an adoptive mom and with a child who, looked quite different from me just in terms of the fact that
Sure.
she was Guatemalan and I'm not, there was even like in the supermarket, people would have this assumption,
Mhm.
Sure.
right? Just from afar.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It brings me to a question that has been sort of on my mind as I was reading the book, which was because you speak to the idea so much around even what we're talking about right now. I wouldn't have signed up for that, but I'm glad that I did. But this idea of who we are before an experience and how we even react to people having the experience that we end up having later versus who we become when we've had the experience and what we start to know. And I was just thinking, like, yeah, what do you wish a younger version of you would have known? Or what do you
Oh my
wish
God.
people knew that you know
Yeah.
now?
Well, I will tell you, I mean, I have examples of it. I remember once before I had kids, I was out to eat and there was a mama and her kid, and the kid started having a really loud and uncontrollable outburst. And now, all these years later, I understand, whatever they were dealing with, something. Everybody was staring at them, and it was maybe like a 9-year-old or something. And the poor mom was like scrambling to get him together and to get her stuff and get outside the restaurant so that she could kind of deal with it. And everybody just was watching this. And I thought, my goodness, now I'd be right out there saying, Mama, what can I do for you? Oh, you left your coat. Can I help you? Do you want me to get you some food? Whatever it is, you jump in.
Mm.
But at the time, I was right with everybody else. I mean, I just didn't know. I remember one time I was in an elevator with one of my kids, and there was a mom with her son, and he was very visibly disabled. And my kid said, "What's wrong with your son?" And I was mortified, mortified. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
And the mom said whatever she said, oh, his body doesn't work like yours does, whatever. And she looked at me, she said, I'd much rather have people ask
Mm.
than stare or look away, And if you had told me I'm going to be that mom, I would have been like, what? And now I'm like, oh my God, if I could just go back, like I get her. I am her. So many examples like that. It's hard to know until you've been there, but we can try to share our stories and educate so that, I mean, I feel like if there were certain things I had heard earlier on, maybe my behaviors and my outlook would have been different. I don't think you have to go through it personally
Right.
to be able to be a little bit more
Yeah.
empathetic.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it offers two things. So one is a window, like we all only see each other in passing generally. Like even sometimes our friends, depending on the sort of layer of friends, unless you're me and Rebecca, who we only have best friends, basically. We don't know how to be casual friends with people.
I'm kind of like that too.
Yeah. We're like, let's drop in, talk about the real stuff.
Yeah.
Bonded for life.
I'm like, here's my whole heart. Are you
Right. I'm
ready?
like, I had small talk. No,
Can't.
thank you. No.
I can't. So, but generally people know each other as colleagues in passing, or, I know you from church or whatever it is. So I think these bold and vulnerable memoirs give us a window into the depth of people's lives. Like, even though you had colleagues that I loved when you sort of ran into your colleague's office and said, here's this study, read this. Am I reading this correctly? Like, they know about you and your family and Dahlia, but there was probably so much that they didn't
Oh,
and
that
probably
was,
learned.
yeah, and that friend was an exception. I will say now what's
Mm,
fascinating to me is how many former colleagues are coming to me and saying, "My God, I knew that Dahlia wasn't well, but I had no idea."
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it opens up that window of empathy for all of us to remember that we don't have any idea. And then also for a new mom or dad who is going to face this, and that they don't feel so alone, and that they hear in your book mistakes and triumphs and setbacks and all of these things, so that, whoever it is just doesn't feel
Mhm.
as lonely.
Thank you for saying that, and when I was pitching the book, I said it's both window and mirror,
Mhm.
depending, so.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, yeah. You knew what you were doing.
I do feel like an important part of this story and this lasting piece for me is Dahlia. Like, I know this little girl now through the story that you've shared, and she's exquisite. Like, I just feel like she's such a teacher on so many levels. And so I would love for you to share about Dahlia. But then if you want to hear, like, I can talk about how she has already impacted my life.
Oh my God, I would love to hear that, and that is the best, biggest compliment I could ever receive is that people get to know Dahlia because, one of the things when we lose somebody who we know is magic and so spectacular, and
Yeah.
probably when we lose somebody who's just
Right.
average too, um, is we feel like, poor world.
Yeah.
Like the world does not get to know my person. And so when we write a book or when we get to have conversations,
Mm.
people get to know a little bit about them. And I
Mm.
think anybody who gets to know Dahlia is better for
Yeah.
it. So, yeah, I mean, I could talk about Dahlia all day long, but it would be a gift to me to hear what you took.
Yeah. Well, I have chills. So I feel like even before you gave voice to it, I mean, I think just talking about her or the ways she was in the, it's like, my okay, mommy, or like, these ways of just a resilient spirit and a way that she was joyful about life and being alive. And like at every stage of sort of you're watching as a mom, you're in your hypervigilance, just like, okay, these things are happening. This is getting worse. We need to take care of this. It's like, okay, I can't run like I used to run, but if you push me fast, I'm going to have so much joy. I just love moving fast, and this way
Yes.
of there's still something to savor in life. What's happening around me is just happening. I mean, she felt like this beautiful model of acceptance
Mm.
without anyone being like, let me train you in acceptance. And I loved that they called
Yeah,
her.
no, she trained us.
Yeah,
Right.
She trained us for sure.
definitely. And I love when someone called her the Dalai Lama and
Yes, Dahlia Lama.
yeah.
We learned so much. And I got to tell you, everything you say is so right on. And thank you. Thank you for sharing that because that is true. That is who she was. And it was about finding joy, exuding joy. And when you exude joy, by the way, people are going to reflect that back to you. I mean,
Mhm.
that's
Yeah.
the best. And that's what she did. And nobody had to tell her to do it or teach her. Again, she was teaching us. And she was saying to us, yes, I can be, she was saying, in the most horrible, nightmarish situation anybody could imagine. A situation where I no longer have a speaking voice. I no longer can eat. I can't walk. I'm attached to machines and I can be
Mm,
joyous. And she could say all that without verbalizing
yeah.
it and make herself heard.
Yeah.
Yeah, I echo those lessons. And then there were these things about her personality that just came shining through, which is like, oh, that's why this book is probably why this book is purple with some pink on it.
And why I'm wearing
And why you're
purple,
wearing
yes.
purple. Her first hearing aids, found it purple with sparkles. And after losing her voice, being able to choose her own clothes and being so
Yeah.
specific. I have a niece. I know what that's like. They just have their ideas in their head. And I just love that she
Yes.
was like, I don't care. I still am going to make a decision about how I'm feeling and what I want to wear today.
Yes.
And then I think my favorite story was when she got caught cheating at Shoots and Ladders. And your
Right?
instinct, which I totally understood, because I do this when my husband's playing with my boys, and I'm like, "Just let them win," like, let's
Yes,
and
totally.
then and when Shauna called her out and Talia laughed, she knew what she was doing.
Exactly, exactly. She just wanted to be treated like a kid, you know? She
Yeah.
just was like, "Hey, let's, like, have a childhood here."
Yeah,
Totally. And another piece, you don't say it explicitly, but as we're talking, I see it as well, is like when we're talking about that part of us, it's like, oh, like be nice so that they'll give us a good treatment. And I just love she's so clear and so authentic about just what she likes and what she doesn't like. And the whole like when the person's reading, was it Junie B. Jones that she liked?
Yeah.
yeah,
And they pull another book and she's like thumbs down. Like she's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
worried about, oh, I want you to like me. She's like, I want to
Right.
like the book that we're about to read.
Oh,
So
yeah. She had listen, one of her, babysitters texted me last night, Pinkalicious. I
oh,
don't know if you know this
yes,
oh
book.
I
right.
do.
Yes. Texted me Pinkalicious and was like, had seen it out somewhere and just texted it to me with a bunch of hearts because it made her think of Dahlia because Dahlia loved Pinkalicious. I mean, she knew what
Mhm.
she loved for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, I love
Yeah.
that so much.
So
And I think,
beautiful.
for people who are disabled, kids, adults, whatever, so much of their agency, depending on what their disability is, can be taken away.
Totally.
We don't even know we're doing it. And she wasn't going to let that happen.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And their agency taken away, and then the way that the world treats them, right? Like,
Yeah,
Mhm.
infantilizing them even as they grow
exactly.
older and all of these different things. So I loved those reminders of, like, in so many ways, she was an exception and unique, and in other ways, she was like a young girl. She was a middle child. She was the only
Yes.
girl. She was, in so many other ways, she
Yeah.
was also, like, typical, which I think was so beautiful
Mhm.
to share with us. It was beautiful.
Mhm. And I really loved I felt like I was sharing a moment with you when the Israeli doctor was like, "She has a spark." Like, and I
Yes,
was just like, "I
I
know
love that,
she
and
does." I
I love
didn't
that
even
I
yeah.
wrote down what he said, and I didn't really typically do that, but I wrote that down so that years later, I was able to, like, really quite word for word quote him because I
Yeah.
love that he saw that, and he was like, "Most of the time I tell people it's time," and he said, "No, I see something in her."
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I wanna bring in, because we're talking about children and treating them differently, the part that, was so powerful and important, the moment that your son comes in is like, "Something's wrong with
Yeah.
me because 'cause I'm sad," and the ways that we think we're doing our children a service to be like, "Everything's okay, and we're not sad," and then
Yes.
he's like, "You guys are never sad."
This is to me the one thing that I try and, like, work into every conversation because it's another thing that I feel like, "My God, if I had heard this earlier, I would have done things differently."
Mhm.
And, I have grace and understanding and compassion for why I did what I did, but it wasn't the right thing to do, which is to try to shoulder this so my other kids wouldn't have to. And that's
Mhm.
ludicrous. But at the time, it made sense. It was like they're carrying enough, and we're going to be strong, and we're going to make them, as much as possible. Things are okay. Things are fine. We've got this. We've got this. Because I didn't want them to have to carry anymore. Well, things weren't fine.
Yeah.
I mean, that was readily apparent. And so when our eldest comes to us and says, "Something's wrong with me. I'm so angry and scared and sad, and I'm praying, and she's not getting better, and you're fine. What's wrong with me?" I was like, "Oh my God,
Mm.
how am I preparing these children for the world if they think that it's not okay to be sad and scared and angry when there's every reason to be?" And they need to know, yes, those feelings are not only okay, but they're good and well deserved. And we can integrate them and move forward in a healthy way with them. If I'm not teaching them that, what am I
Right.
doing?
Mm.
Right. And so good that he verbalized it
Oh my
because
God. I was like,
it's
thank you.
sort
Thank
of
you.
yeah, it's like what we internalize. Like, something's wrong with me, but I'm not even gonna
Yeah.
talk about
Yeah.
it. But he felt safe enough to at least say, "Hey,
Yes.
guys,
It
can
was
you
a
help
gift. It
me?"
really was.
Yeah, beautiful.
And by the way, even now, years later, I am way more conscious of telling my kids when I feel stressed or angry or any of those
Mhm.
things because I want them to know, like, yeah, everybody feels that way. That's
Yeah.
totally normal. I am so nervous about the speech I'm about to give, and I'm going to go give it and I'll get through it.
Right.
They need to know.
Yeah, the reality. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I wanted to I'm so glad we're talking about them, but I'd love to hear, how are the boys doing? How was their process? We talked about your grief looks really different from your husband's. How are the boys?
I think it's really complicated. I
Yeah.
think it will be a lifelong journey for them,
Yeah.
and they deal with it very differently from each other, just as
Yeah.
my oldest sister and I dealt differently from each other. And, as parents, we just try to make sure they know that any way they're feeling
Mhm.
is okay. And there's no stages and there's no time period. And I will
Right.
grieve my sister every day of my life. And I assume they will grieve their sister every day of their
Yeah.
lives. And I couldn't imagine it any other way.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
okay.
Well, I send them my love. I send all of you. I send all of you my love. So, in your intro, we talked about your personal survival kit, and you have a slightly more nuanced one over on your website, and I loved it so much. So, I'd love to hear from you the things that you have found that have helped you persevere and move through these losses and be generous and kind with yourself. So, we had talked a little bit earlier, but the ones that are on your website are Hope and Humor, Grit and Grace, Devouring Great Books, Corners of Beauty, and Writing It Down.
Yes. Those things are kind of when I think about what are the different aspects of what I love to do, what I love to take in and put out. And so, for example, for me, reading has always been just the best, not only escape, but also the best way to find out how
Mm,
I'm feeling, right? And so it can do both of those things. And sometimes it can, even one book can do both of those things, right? And there are even 3 writers that I talk about quite a bit in my book because they had such a big impact on me during this journey. So, Mary Oliver, when I talk about A Summer's Day and just the gorgeous poem that I came to understand over the course of my daughter's life and really understand through her work about appreciating and being so, so, so present. And then a reader who couldn't be more different in biography from me, which is
mm,
James Baldwin, and understanding through him what it means to stand up to tragedy and to pick up our bag, baby, and do it again, which was something that, in Uses of the Blues that he says. And then my own father, who was a completely gifted, gorgeous writer and wrote many books. And through his writings, I was able to have conversations with him, even though he was gone, about love and loss because he had written so much about it after losing his
mhm,
daughter, my sister. So, these things become such a
Mm.
balm and an inspiration and whatever you're looking for. So for me, that's the reading. And then the writing is, again, being able to create some order, to have some control over the narrative in a world that's spinning so wildly out of control. To tell it from
mm.
my point of view is just something that I really love doing and have found very important.
That's beautiful.
Mm. Well, and there's this constant, like, create a world of beauty, this sort of
Yeah.
directive from your dad, and then the idea of, like, in the chaos, it's already a beautiful world, this, the "You are a child of the universe"
Yes.
piece that Nomi had, and
Yeah.
it's both
Yeah.
It's both
and
and I
yeah.
gotta tell you, I mean, these things that talk about gifts and my father left me writings to be read after he died, and one of them I found years later, and it was like actually, my a friend was over, and she was cleaning up some stuff for me, helping me out in my office, and she found a sealed envelope
Yeah.
with my name on it in his handwriting, and it was like a day where I really needed it,
Ugh.
and it was gorgeous, and, so these gifts that I have in the writing that they left for me.
Right, right.
I had sent a message to Rebecca while reading the book, and I was like, "I love her dad. I
I
love her
know,
Yeah.
I
dad
love
so much."
and he'd love
Yeah.
that. He'd be like, "Oh, there are these, like, beautiful women all over the place loving me now." He would be into that. By the way, I will tell you a little aside, which is that as I've been out on book tour, 3 separate occasions, I have had a woman come up to me and said, "I dated your dad."
Oh, oh my gosh. Wow.
Oh, hi.
3 times. I'm like, "Okay." I mean, but he and my mom split when I was 5, so there were many,
Yeah,
many
yeah, there
years
was a
from
lot of time.
50
It was
to
time for him
80.
to
It's
date.
so funny.
That is so
That's
funny. Oh
so
my
cute.
goodness. Well, I loved him even all the way through. I just started to fall in love with him.
Yeah.
What a beautiful way he had of showing up for you and with Dahlia, and even toward the end when he was, sort of like convince the people to roll him up to in a wheelchair that he found up to your room. I mean, it just like my heart just came out of my chest. It was
Mhm.
just beautiful. So thank you for sharing him with us as well.
Thank you for
Yeah.
saying that.
Yeah, and I think I mean, you have this podcast so beautifully named. I don't know how you do it. And I love the moment you sort of say that to your sister in the book and she's like, "What are you talking about?" Like you're doing so much. But the ways that we like think, I couldn't do that, but I can do this.
That's what's so fascinating to me, and that's why I wanted to do the podcast because, like, I never would have thought I could do what I did, and I think that's true for all of us. We do not know what we're capable of until we're put in that situation, and then why do
Mhm.
we look at other people and think, "I could never do it?" But we do. I'll never forget being on a panel years ago with a mom who had twin teenage girls who were severely disabled. They're both in wheelchairs, and my daughter, they were the same age. My daughter was attached to a ventilator and was 24/7 eyes on. Okay, so I'm looking at this other mother going, I don't know how you do that because with 2 girls in wheelchairs, she couldn't go out alone with both of her daughters.
Right.
They do not make double wheelchairs, like they make double
No.
strollers. And that to me was like, I couldn't imagine because I went everywhere with Dahlia. And she's looking at me and going, I do not know how you do it because 24/7, we had to have our eyes on Dahlia. And so, it was just such a perfect example. I'm sure the rest of the world was looking at both of us going, I don't know how
How
you
do
do it,
any of you do it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. You don't know how people, but we do. We do. And that's why it's tongue in
Yeah.
cheek, the name of the podcast,
Yeah.
obviously.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love it too.
All right, so we're going to wrap up our conversation today, but and check out as we usually do with checking in on our grief, but such a rich conversation, Jessica,
Beautiful.
and yeah,
And
love the
what a
book.
beautiful book. My
Such a
goodness.
contribution. Yeah. So, as we do, Andrea, how are you touching into your grief this week?
Yeah. So, as when we started on the podcast, we started talking about this season, and Jessica shared that they built their first ofrenda last year. And so I usually start earlier. I like to have everybody out, but it's just been such a tender time. And so last night I finally I have an altar up all the time, all year round. And so in the fall, this is always a good time to sort of take everything down and literally sweep my altar space and put down different blankets that I use for Dia de Muertos. And so I started that process yesterday, and I lit a candle. I had, kept a candle burning for my cousin, which I did for my cousin last year, which I had done for my grandmother and my
Mm.
father. And so it just my heart felt a little more prepared than I had been last week. And the boys have been waiting. They really love it. They love to bring the little items to people. They love to bring, like my grandfather, cards. They like to bring fishing stuff to their abuelo. They like to bring dog treats to the dogs, which last year our dog ate a bunch of stuff off the ofrenda, so we're gonna have to rethink that. But so it just felt ready. So I've been touching into my grief by preparing my altar space for my ancestors. Yeah.
Mm, beautiful. Yeah. And how about you, Jessica? Have you been touching into your grief this week?
Well, so this week was a big week for me in that respect because 2 nights ago, I gave my first TED Talk, and
Yeah.
it will be up and people can view it, but it's all about grief literacy. And it's
Mm.
about this idea that grief is really the most universal thing there is. We're all going to go through it. And yet we're so awkward and uncomfortable and we don't know what to say and we're so scared of it. And how might we do better as a society? And what are some specifics we can take away in terms of, first of all, things we say that are well intentioned, but actually have the opposite effect of what we're hoping? And then,
Mhm.
what can we do and say that might be more supportive for grievers, and how can we as a society,
Mhm.
as I said, really become grief literate.
Beautiful.
Oh,
Yeah.
Thank
congratulations
you.
on being selected. I know it can be quite the process, and we're so grateful. I cannot wait to watch it. We will be sure to share that out as
Thank you.
well.
Thank you. They said, yeah, 5 weeks, so I don't know when
Okay.
Okay.
Well, as soon as
it's
it's up,
airing,
we're
but
sharing it. Yeah.
yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Rebecca, how have you been touching into your grief?
Oh, I say this often, but I run grief groups, and we do the Wild Edge of Sorrow, Francis Weller's book, twice a year. And so last night I had my group, and it's so fascinating to me as many times as I've read that book, how I'll read it and I'm like, I don't remember him saying that before. And sometimes it almost feels like I stepped into another universe where the book is different. And I'm like, oh, this is this version this week. But I'm on the 5 gates of grief, and I really took my time with it and was writing a lot of notes. And now I have like a special notebook just for the 5 gates. And I could really feel this way that both gates, the sorrow of the world and ancestral grief, were intertwined. And when he's talking about the sorrow of the world, he's talking mainly about earth grief, like so not so much world events, but sort of the ways that we treat the natural world and we don't see ourselves as part of it. But I could feel how that was intertwined with ancestral grief and just this way that we've lost so much of going all the way back to sort of these ancestors that I would have had who were more living close to the earth and being in nature and feeling the connection of
Mhm.
with the seasons or with animals or with different things, in the way that when we started to distance ourselves from that, we were simultaneously distancing ourselves from understanding ourselves as part of nature, being in the world in a way that we saw
Mm.
animals as teachers, or, had a certain awe and reverence for the world that we're in, regardless of religious affiliation or anything, just to have awe at our world. And so I've been feeling that acutely this week, and sort of this, gosh, are they separate gates almost question, where I'm like, there's just a way we've been cut off from sort of our birthright of knowing ourselves and our place in the universe and in the cosmos. And yeah, so I've just been working with that this week.
Beautiful. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing. Jessica, thank you so much. Thank you for writing this book, sharing Dahlia and all of your beloved family members with us, and coming on our podcast to share and chat with us. It's been so lovely. And there is so much more to this book. So I am excited for everybody to get their copies or listen to it. And we will be sure and share your TED Talk when it comes out.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was really my pleasure.
Beautiful. Bye, y'all. We love you.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of All the Grief. You can find us on Instagram at All the Grief Pod. And please take a moment to rate our podcast and share us with your friends. We'd love to keep expanding our reach to all the people who could benefit from conversations on grief. Take care.